from smart cities to a smart world. Independent of MIT's Media Lab once said, our financial, transportation, and health systems are broken. In fact, these are the noble goals of traffic planning: better mobility, less pollution, less noise, and less traffic. But this is often the reality: congestion, traffic jams, urban gridlock. Now, does it have to be like this? I actually don't think so, because biological cells tell us that things can work pretty smooth, right? In a cell, we also have the situation that materials are transported towards the center. And if there were traffic jams, we wouldn't live very long. In fact, there are some diseases where this cellular transport is disturbed, and these are terrible diseases. So we could learn from nature, and I will present some ideas very much related to self-organization, but self-organization by itself doesn't necessarily produce desirable outcomes. So let's look into freeway traffic, and I'd like to start with an experiment that Yuki Sugiyama, who is with us, has performed. And as you can see over here, I have seen that probably many times, after sometimes the density is sufficiently high, there will be a spontaneous breakdown of traffic flow. Now, the bad thing is that the point that we would like to operate the system in, which is the point of maximum flow, is actually an unstable point. And that's why there's a capacity drop and the system becomes inefficient. All of that has to do, of course, with nonlinear complex dynamics. And if we want to learn more about it, then we need to get traffic data. And if you just take the measurements as you get them from freeway sections, then it looks like this. Yeah, you don't really see the clear pattern. You first have to come up with a measurement method that allows you to really see what's going on in the data. This is work that has been done together with Martin Treiber and others, Arne Kesting, for example, as well. And what we then find is still very complex traffic patterns. And to be honest, if we had seen these patterns in the beginning when I started to do traffic modeling, we would probably have given up upon it. But by that time, we had already published all sorts of papers with traffic models, so there was no way back, and so it was a matter of honor to really come up with an explanation of this. And in fact, we succeeded. And what needs to be explained is a surprising variety of congestion patterns. And the idea that we had is maybe there are some elementary patterns, as there are elementary particles, and complex patterns would be composed of these elementary patterns. And in fact, these elementary patterns can be simulated both with macroscopic traffic models and microscopic traffic models. There are many of them, and some traffic models produce different kinds of outcomes, and so they're in a different class of traffic models. Now, of course, the interesting part is how close do these models come to reality? I mean, there are really some very surprising phenomena. Over here, for example, there's a freeway with an on-ramp, and you can see that we have a smooth flow actually. Until there is a reduction in the density, you would think that's even better, but instead, because this turns out to be an overcritical perturbation, this is eventually amplified. It has already crossed over here the location of the bottleneck, but then it returns, which we call the boomerang effect, and once it comes back to the bottleneck again, traffic breaks down, as we've seen it before, and there is some oscillatory flow. So highly complex, and the question is, do these kind of things, which are really astonishing, happen also in reality? And in fact, boomerang effects can be found many times in our data. But if you look at this closely, then you notice a small difference from what we expected. namely there is an increase in amplitude, but only once the wave travels back. While it travels forward, the amplitude doesn't really increase. And you see that even more clearly in that presentation over here. So, the extension of the perturbation gets longer, and only when it returns you see this growing amplitude. Now the question is, what does it really mean? And then if you look at these lines over here, the speed at which the front of this propagates, it turns out to be 80 kilometers an hour. And then, oh, that must be a truck. And so, most likely there is an overtaking maneuver of one truck by another truck. And then what happens is all the cars basically queue up behind this moving bottleneck, and it produces a platoon that grows over time. And once this platoon gets close to this off-ramp over here, which produces lane changes and perturbations, that finally triggers the increasing amplitude. That means a traffic jam. So that means in that operation regime we have meta stability. Okay, now the question is there a systematics when these different kinds of traffic states occur? And based on our models, we've come up with schematic phase diagrams, and they basically say under what kind of flow conditions you have free traffic flow and stop-and-go traffic, homogeneous congested traffic, localized clusters, and all this. And Martin, of course, has been part of all these publications. Now, if you look at empirical data, then yeah, there is some order in the data, but also it's not as clear as in the prediction. And what turns out then, however, well, we've always assumed that the outflow from traffic jams would be a constant. In reality, it's not. And this is because of the weather conditions. So when it's raining, then the outflow is smaller, and we need to consider that when we investigate real-life traffic. So now if we scale the flows by this measured outflow, which depends on the weather condition, then you find a very clear picture. In fact, that corresponds very nicely to the phase diagram that I showed you before. Now, there was also a lot of discussion about the general pattern and pinch effect and all these kind of things. And from our point of view, this is a result of the freeway design, because freeways don't have just one bottleneck, an on-ramp, but instead, you have an off-ramp and then an on-ramp to get rid of some traffic before new cars enter the freeway. And if you take that into account, then that produces a more complicated mathematical analysis, which, however, can still be done. And so there are different phases in the sense that are distributed along the freeway, and that produces exactly these kinds of pinch effects and general patterns. But only when we have these kind of freeway designs. If we just have a gradient, that means the freeway goes uphill, then we find other patterns which don't look like general patterns. Another kind of controversy was about these wide scattered flows in congested traffic. And so that very much is very much different from the jam lines that people would expect. However, if we take into account that not only the density is a variable, but also the time gap and the jam density as a function of the fraction of trucks on the freeway, then we can actually reproduce all these small details of the empirical data, because there's not just a variation of density, but there's also a variation of the slope of this jam line. And in fact, it turns out that we can very well reproduce all these patterns with the widely scattered traffic flows, even with a macroscopic flow model, if we have a multi-class model that distinguishes between cars and trucks. So there's no magic behind that, really. It's a matter of heterogeneity of real traffic flow. So to conclude this, I would say that traffic congestion can be very well understood today, and you've all made really important contributions to this to understand it much better than I understand it today, most likely. And it's predictive. We can really predict the extension of the congestion and also how much the travel times would go up. And there is a collection of works that you may want to pay attention to, an analytical theory of traffic flow. And that basically describes how we can understand all these phenomena in a bottom-up way from first principles. And in fact, just for you, I've uploaded the fragments of a book I've been working on a couple of years back, and I never managed to finish it. So you can find it at ResearchGate. And whoever is interested in finishing it is very welcome. I most likely wouldn't find the time anymore because I'm now focusing on other issues, but I hope it's helpful for you. Now the question, how can we get rid of congestion? And there, of course, there are new technologies, car-to-car communication, and all this, and one can say, we've done that many years back, when nobody was talking about Google self-driving cars, obviously, right? But now for everyone it's clear, cars become smart, they have perception, communication, cognition, decision-making, and all of this. And they can help to measure the traffic state they're in. They do that collectively. We have to determine the jam fronts, basically, and that requires some sophistication. In fact, some particular communication protocols that work also if only a few cars are equipped with this communication technology, a small percentage. And then we can in fact determine the jam fronts. And why is this important? Because we want to respond to the traffic situation in an adaptive way through adaptive cruise control systems. And we have done that in a way that is specific to the situation the car is in. So the parameters of, in this case, the intelligent driver model are being changed depending on the situation, and then you basically get rid of this terrible stop-and-go traffic. You must have seen that video many times, so I don't show it until the very end. The main trick is really these systems can change the interactions between cars, and they stabilize traffic flows and increase capacity. We call this mechanism design, and the entire trick is that we use real-time data for real-time feedback. Now, the interesting point is that this system is based on a distributed control approach. That means it's a decentralized system, not controlled by a traffic center. And it also works if not all cars are equipped with this kind of technology. So if only 20, 30, 40% of cars are equipped, there is an effect on the entire traffic flow, and that is quite interesting, I believe, which helps, of course, to introduce these strategies. I'm not sure Google's self-driving cars have this collective effects built in, So that might still be something worth paying attention to. And of course, then freeways are not everything. They build a network. We want to know what's the level of service, and we can actually measure that in a driver-oriented way from the perspective of the individual, and in this way get a better picture of how comfortable traffic situations are. Here is another myth that I'd like to confront. So people have often said, Everyone spends a certain amount of time in traffic, so it's called a travel time budget. But it turns out if we compare different modes of transportation, these budgets are very different. And in fact, they're also different from one city to another. So there is no constant travel time budget. Instead, it turns out actually that travel time budgets very much depend on housing costs. So if you want to do something about induced traffic flow and reduce it, then you need to reduce housing costs. So it's a completely new perspective, I would say. Now, in networks, in particular urban networks, of course, we have traffic lights. And traffic light control is an old business, basically since the early days of computers. They've been used to control traffic lights. Now, we had a particular approach to this. The idea was, couldn't we come up again with a distributed bottom-up approach that would create harmonious flows by self-minimization? And so I'd like to compare three ways of organizing traffic light control. One is based on a traffic control center, which tries to figure out the optimal control scheme and then implement it in the entire town in a top-down way. We call that central control as if there was a benevolent dictator. Unfortunately, traffic light optimization is an NP-hard optimization problem, and even in medium-sized cities that cannot be strictly done in real time, so you need to do all sorts of approximations, and as you do that, many good solutions are maybe thrown away. I mean, the idea is we have a cyclic operation at each intersection, and then we synchronize these cycles, and that should be good, shouldn't it? Now we'll see how good that really works. The other approach is bottom-up self-minimization, so each single intersection would separately optimize the traffic light in such a way that the waiting times of those cars that are approaching that intersection are strictly minimized. This is what the Homo economicus would do if he would be sitting in such an intersection and control the traffic lights over there. So it's kind of the concept that we know from mainstream economics. And there is another approach where we do the same thing, but if there is a queue that extends a certain critical length, as we say, then we stop the minimization of travel times and first clear the queue before we go back to waiting time minimization. So you would think this is better than that, and for sure optimal top-down control should be the best, right? That's the intuition, what intuition tells us. So let's look actually in the results that we get. And then it turns out top-down regulation has this more or less linear increase of the queue length with capacity utilization, and of course that makes a lot of sense. The question is, how well does actually this selfish optimization a la Homo economicus work? And then it turns out, wow, that's much better, much shorter queue lengths. And we could say, yeah, Adam Smith's invisible hand is at work. It makes traffic flows very efficient. But then if you look further, then we notice that, what's that? So suddenly queue lengths are exploding, and beyond a certain capacity, Adam Smith's invisible hand fails miserably. And then, of course, the traffic control center says, ha ha ha, that's why we are still needed. And however, if we look at this other regarding optimization that sometimes stops the minimization of waiting times in favor of clearing long queues, then we see that actually works over the entire range. That's work that has been done together with Stefan Nemmer, who's still in Dresden. So we can say we can make the invisible hand work with the right kind of distributed approach. And in fact, it produces beautiful green waves and coordinated patterns of neighboring traffic lights. And there is a flexible adaptation to the actual local traffic flows, which are largely variable. And for that reason, it actually outperforms the classical top-down approach, given the hard predictability of the problem. Now you could say, okay, that was pretty theoretical. Does it work in practice? So we have done over the years studies in Dresden, and you can see it's a pretty complicated network over here in the center. So the authorities of that city have more or less given up on it. They were not satisfied because either they could produce a good flow for cars or a good flow for public transportation, but not for both. And so they said, okay, if you think you're so smart, then you show us that you can do it better. And okay, we were trying this, and you can see there are a lot of trams and buses that are cutting through this area. It's also a highly irregular network, and then we managed, however, to improve traffic flows considerably, and for all modes of transport. And by the way, for the environment, it's good too. Now that was still a pilot study, simulation-based, but in the meantime, there are also real traffic lights operated, and the gain is in the order of 30 to 40%. So it's enormous, even though before they had again optimized the parameters of their previous traffic control. So flexible response in the right way to environmental conditions can be superior. And then the question is, what does it mean for production? Supply chains, can we use it there too? And in fact, there are quite a few analogies between traffic and production. So road sections correspond to buffers, production systems, travel and delay times to cycle times, congestion queues to full buffers, and junctions to processing units, and so on. Accidents to machine breakdowns, and yeah, in fact, we can even find something like traffic jams within these production systems. So if a bottleneck forms, there would be a traffic jam that propagates upstream, and missing quantities go downstream. You can find that basically in these plots that show the usage of the different parts of the system. In fact, there is John Stearman's famous beer game that shows something like stop-and-go waves in logistics systems, and even experienced managers have difficulties actually to avoid this effect. So that's based on instability of the flow again. But of course, in reality, most supply chains are no linear chains, but they're actually networks, and that makes things actually more complicated. But you can write it up, so it's possible to formulate mathematical equations for this, and even to get some analytical solutions. And it turns out there are a number of different possible behaviors, like damped oscillations, overdamped behavior, or growing oscillations. And if we then feed in data about global supply chains, we find that we expect actually these irregular waves that remind of the business cycles that we know. That means booms and recessions are because we have actually these flows in networks. Now then the question, of course, comes up, can we actually reduce these oscillations? And in fact, it turns out that the network structure highly determines the size of the oscillation that results. So you can see the linear supply chain is highly prone to large oscillations, while this kind of network dampens it out pretty much. And so I think it's not by accident that actually the distribution network of Intel technologies looks very similar to this. Yeah, so what do we do with production systems. Now, these are quite complicated systems, but still they can be represented as a network. And then what we did is we came up, worked with Thomas Seidel, with software that does agent-based factory simulation. And the idea is we could again use self-organization principles to operate the system. So imagine all those products are equipped with RFID chips, and so these different products could communicate with each other, but also with the production environment, that means with the machines and all this. And then, in fact, yeah, they can organize themselves. They can self-organize, and in particular, they can find their own ways through the system, and they can come up with a load-dependent organization. So at the moment, all these products take the shortest path, but as the system becomes more crowded, it will turn into a roundabout traffic, as you can see right now. So that's kind of interesting, and we should say there is a new paradigm that goes away from this over-regulation that tries to determine every single action by everyone. There's many signs that tell people what they should do, pretty confusing. Instead, we could have this, and of course in many places we do have these kind of designs that support people in doing the right thing without having to think a lot about what they're doing. And it's astonishing how well that can actually work, this self-organization. And yeah, we would really wonder, why does it work so well? In fact, there is a reason, which is the design of this intersection. It has a unidirectional flow in front, it has a unidirectional flow in the back, and it has a buffer in the middle that allows everyone to adjust the speed in such a way that you would find a gap in the flow that you can easily cross. Now that brings me eventually not only to camels, but also to pedestrians. And as you know, I've been working on this for a long time, and we found these beautiful self-organized patterns, like the lanes of uniform walking direction. And there are all sorts of models, including the social force model, that can describe these kind of phenomena as self-organized phenomena. Now, the question that we had, because I used to be a physicist, is it possible to measure the forces between the pedestrians? As we can do that in physics. There's inverse scattering theory for this. And I always thought, no, it's probably never possible. Then good video technology came up, and we could track people, and in this way, we could do experiments with many people and measure their interactions and eventually determine the forces and come up with data-driven models that would reproduce the behavior of people. And in fact, if we calibrate the micro model, the macro prediction of that model would also fit observations quite well. So then we were always thinking, could we maybe add cognitive features to pedestrians? And we never did that for many years because we thought, okay, that's going to be very complicated, and these decision models behind the human mind that would contain dozens, if not hundreds of parameters, and that wouldn't be very useful. But then Mehdi Mousaid joined my team, and we published this paper in PNAS, and turns out, actually, it just takes two simple heuristics to produce many observations. And the first one is walk into the least obstructed direction and hunt for gaps. The second one is adjust speed to keep time headway constant. Yeah, in any case, I mean, with all the models that are available today, it's possible to come up with planning software that is useful. And as we have seen recently, it's really important that we have tools to plan for safer mass events. So back in 2006, we were asked to evaluate videos of a terrible crowd disaster that had happened in front of the old Jamra bridge. And in the first moment, you wouldn't think that there would be a crowd disaster in an open area, and the width of this entrance is 40 meters, right? But then if you analyze the flow, there is a merging of different flow direction that effectively creates a bottleneck. And to our great surprise, we found that as the density went up, there was eventually a sudden transition to unexpected stop-and-go waves. And not only this, there was a second transition to what we call crowd turbulence, a situation where people are pushed around into all sorts of directions, and that produces an uncontrollable situation. So sooner or later, people would stumble, somebody would stumble, fall on the crowd, that creates a hole in the crowd. What you see here is, by the way, the situation that created the left brake disaster in Duisburg. So these kind of phenomena unfortunately have occurred many times, and have killed many people in situations where nobody wanted to harm anybody, right? So that are situations that obviously get totally out of control, and in many cases even hundreds or thousands of security forces cannot handle these kind of situations. They just get out of hand. Now in Saudi Arabia they had 5,000 CCTV cameras and 100,000 security forces. Still, they didn't manage to control the situation, it seems. Apparently, the preparation hadn't been as good as back in the time when I was involved, which is 8 years ago. So the question is, can we come up with tools that would help the people, the pedestrians, to avoid dangerous situations? And in fact, now there's this possibility that we all use our smartphones, and these smartphones would send some information to a system, and we would get some information back. That means there would be a feedback loop, and basically what we can then have is a system that tells us this is an area that you should better avoid, or this is a way that you should take, or wait 10 more minutes and then the situation would be much better. And these kind of systems are being used now in many places. It has been developed by people like Wolf Blanke and Paul Lukovic and others. And that is a completely new kind of technology that is pretty promising. So that's also pointing the way we should go. Enable people to help themselves and to help each other. And the question, how would we get the data that is needed for this? Well, the idea is we measure it ourselves. So we can build a abstraction nervous system, as we say, to get this data, because we all have a smartphone. These smartphones contain about 15 sensors, which we usually don't use. But we can open them up and we can actually connect smartphones with each other in such a way that we can create a measurement network to measure the world around us. And for example, we can use the acceleration data produced by the smartphone in X, Y, Z direction. The question is, what can we do with it? Well, we could identify collectively road bumps, for example, or we could determine earthquakes, and warn our friends and colleagues automatically. Our smartphones would do that together without having to spy on us, because that's an averaging over the behavior of many smartphones. So it would be certainly very nice to have such a system, I believe. Probably many of you think so too, but we would wish to have a system that we can trust. And so from our point of view, it's very important that you are in control. That means we respect informational self-determination. You can determine which are the sensors that you want to open up. You can determine whether you want to do the measurement just for yourself and keep the data on your smartphone, or you want to share this data with others. And eventually, we should also have a personal data store that allows you to manage your own data and their uses, whom to share it for what for what purpose. So the idea is to run the Internet of Things as a citizen web. Now, all of us could basically run it together, create data together, build that system together, manage it together. So it would be a participatory system. And that would create an open data source and even maybe a real-time data source. And that means a data source that we can all use, a data commons, as I would say. With a micropayment system, we could even run an own business with these kind of data. So there would be news, services, and products, and all these kind of things. We could collaborate. So shouldn't we do this together? The question is, how would it work? So in principle, you can take data as you like, at least a certain volume of it. But of course, it only works if you also give some data back on average. So indirect reciprocity is the principle. Fair play, that's the idea. Same thing with source codes. Yeah? This is an open source project because we want you to be able to contribute and also use our source code. So very quickly we could grow an information and innovation ecosystem together. It means the more products and services are around, the more products and services would become possible given interoperability. And that would allow for combinatorial innovation. In fact, that's what we need in order to cope with the expected job loss in the coming 10, 20 years, which might be up to 50% of the old jobs. So the goal is really to create new opportunities for everyone and also new opportunities for scientists and new jobs. And that's not just a dream, actually. So I have a team of young, cool people who've been working on this, and we are heading towards a system. It's called Swarm Pulse, by the way, that can be used to map the environment and also environmental change. The idea is that we would also measure the externalities of our interactions with others, with the environment, and in this way make a contribution to more awareness and a more sustainable world. And we could even map conflicts and many other things. So get ready for this. Team up with your friends and colleagues and join the Nerdist team. Thank you very much.